All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining on. I know that a lot of people will join on right at 1 or a little after. So as everyone else starts to trickle in, I just wanted to say, number one, good afternoon, and hope everyone's having a great week. Be excited about the presentation that we've got today. My name is Caleb Powell, and I am an environmental scientist for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. I also sit as the Vice President on the Tennessee Recycling Coalition Board. Today we have Alec Cooley with us. He is from Bush Systems. He is a senior advisor at Bush, and he's got extensive knowledge when it comes to recycling and exactly what we're going to be talking about today, designing infrastructure to guide recycling behavior. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Alec. I would like for you to sort of just give a little bit of a background for yourself, and then we'll get right into your presentation.
Sure. That sounds good. So again, as Caleb said, my name is Alec Cooley, and I'm a senior advisor with Bush Systems. For those of you who are not familiar with the company, we are based out of Ontario, Canada, and primarily we're known for recycling bins, trash bins for institutional settings, offices, front of house types of settings, and of course, always happy to make referrals or answer any questions folks have about that. But what my role is in the company is to be the resident recycling expert. And a lot of this has to do with the behavior side and how do you set up infrastructure. So I do my own webinar series, have a blog series, and I have the fun job of getting to sort of focus on these best practices and how we get them out and help to improve programs across the country. I'm actually based here in South Carolina, so I'm just over across the border in Charleston. So with that, what I'm going to talk about today is it's about infrastructure and about the role it plays with guiding behavior, as the title suggests. Primarily what I'm going to be talking about is it's specific to institutional settings like offices, universities, government buildings, public spaces, areas where you have a public-facing infrastructure that people are interacting with, as opposed to making the distinction with residential, which is a little bit of a different animal, although some of these principles that I'm going to talk about also certainly apply on that side as well. A number of the things that I'm going to talk about are probably going to be very familiar to some of you. For others, maybe not as much, but talking about things like color distinction, restrictive lids, aspects about how you actually design the bins, signage that have that influence, and many of these have been around for many years. But I'm also going to talk about some other aspects of this, including service arrangements with custodial and how other aspects of that can also have that effect to change people's behavior. So many of these may be familiar, but what I hope to do with this presentation is introduce high level some of these to those of you who are not familiar, but also reinforce that these aren't just good ideas or things that maybe we should consider, but these are evidence-based, that there's research that shows science backing up that these have a measurable impact, improving things like contamination. And then finally, what I want to do is try to frame these within a holistic framework to show that these are not just isolated practices, best practices. These are part of more of a systems approach in how we improve in a systematic way. How do we improve infrastructure so that it functions better? So with that said, at this point, I think we're all familiar, if you've worked in the recycling industry for any length of time, with just the issue of contamination and how pervasive it is. Obviously, it's been a big factor in the headlines over the last 5-10 years. You're very familiar with your own programs on the challenges of how we clean this up. The good news, I think, from the last few years with the Trident National Sword and the market disruption is that it's forcing us as an industry to focus much more on this and to try and address some of the root causes of this. What I would say to start out is that I think a lot of that effort that we put into addressing contamination is primarily about based on the assumption that we need to provide people the knowledge, the information they need so that they know how to correctly sort items. Obviously, that's a huge part of it. That's very important. But I think too often we tend to pause there and assume that's it. People are smart, so you just need to give them the information and they will do what you want them to do. But there is decades of experience with the knowledge that it is not that simple. And so that starts to point the direction towards some of the aspects that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is a sort of a down and dirty, oversimplified way of framing this, but just as a setup, what are some of the causes of contamination, and as well as its flip side, which is recycling ending up in the trash, which is all boils down to just a sorting decision process. We know that product design is a big aspect of it. There's a lot of confusion that's created at the very beginning when product designers make things with different types of plastic resins and other aspects that are very similar and easy to confuse. Operational factors are a big factor with contamination, obviously, on the back end with the ability to get things mixed. When glass goes in with paper into a hauler packing truck, that becomes a source of contamination. But a big part of this is also behavior-based. And within that, I think we can break this down into a couple different categories. There are those who obviously, they just don't care. If it's a bin and it's in front of them, they're going to use it. And to some degree, there's not a whole lot you can do with somebody who has that basic ambivalence. But fortunately, the vast majority of people, and again, there's survey research that backs this up, the vast majority of people are more than willing to participate with recycling with some level of enthusiasm, but it's how do we engage them. So for those folks, some of these other factors kick in. It's the lack of a convenient alternative. Very few people are going to walk past 3 trash cans before they can finally find the one recycling bin that's on the opposite side of a plaza or at the end of a hallway. Confusion and lack of knowledge, which we've already addressed this to some degree. And then there's lack of attention. And this is an area where I would argue that we tend to have an overly simplistic understanding of behavior and miss this critical fact. And this really gets to the practices that I'm going to be talking about. So I like to frame this as what I call the Homer principle, which is just the understanding that trash is not that interesting to people. People may want to do the right thing, but we have to understand that there's only so much attention span that people are willing to dedicate to something that, by definition, holds no value to them. If they're getting ready to throw something away, it's almost always going to be a low end of their priority list to focus attention on. And so we need to anticipate that when we think about how they're going to interact with infrastructure. It's important to have the pre-knowledge, the understanding up front before you arrive at that point where you're actually making that sorting decision. But a lot of the behavior that we're trying to influence is in that moment of decision, that split second when they are standing in front of the bin. And again, I'm way oversimplifying some of these behavioral principles, but some I think that apply to the situation is understanding that it's great if people have an intrinsic appreciation for recycling and for the benefits and for why they should be doing that. That definitely can help to motivate and increase the percentage of the time that people participate. But a big part of this is simply getting people into a habit. And again, there's a lot of evidence that backs that up, that you need people just to develop a routine, and that routine creates its own force that helps to motivate people in the moment when they're making that decision. Now, to do that, you've got to, again, understanding that if you don't have a lot of attention, how do you remove the barriers that can slow people down in that moment of decision and force them to apply more attention than they're necessarily willing to do in that given situation. So we have to remove barriers to what they're doing, and we need to have infrastructure that will just guide their intuitive behavior going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into some of these practices in more depth, starting with well, actually, before I jump into it, let me talk a little bit more about some of the basic barriers that do exist with infrastructure on a typical level in most communities, or certainly in many communities that we're starting at the starting point. One is that over time, infrastructure and programs are typically designed on a local level. Your community, you're involved with setting up programs, but then each different office building, every property owner, everybody goes about setting up their own infrastructure, and we create this very hodgepodge system, which makes it inconsistent and requires people to relearn what it is they're supposed to do from one location to the next, when bins look different, when they're different colors. All these create a barrier to that smooth routine. Structurally, having sort of antiquated legacy systems where, going back to back in the days when it was just trash collection, you might just only have a trash bin available and you don't have recycling convenience. And then, I spoke about how this is really focusing more on institutional levels, but this, where it does apply, I think, to residential programs, et cetera, is just the lack of coordination across jurisdictions. How can we come up with a consistent standard? This photo in the upper right-hand corner is from my community here, where we have blue recycling bins, and then we have blue trash bins. And you can start to see how this adds in unnecessary levels of confusion that, yes, people are smart enough, if they stop and they look at it, they can tell the difference between those when you look at the label, but that doesn't mean they're automatically going to do that. And then the last point I would make here, which I'll touch on more later, is just the actual service arrangements and understanding how what we're asking people to do and where we ask them to go to empty materials, that also has an impact on their behavior in a way that can be shaped. The second primary obstacle when we talk about institutional settings and public space is this eternal debate between form and function. And this is where the architects come in. This is where the decision makers, the administrators who want something that looks nice. This boils down in many cases to the aesthetic considerations, which all too often override some of these best practices. And if you ever tried to work in a facility to do this, and you've experienced the pushback, you know exactly what I'm talking about. When it comes down to it, you can have bins that look very nice and also serve the purpose that we need them to do. But if you disregard the best practices, if you don't consider things like the color distinction, when you're making those decisions, you're setting yourself up for a crash. You're making an investment in an infrastructure that is structurally deficient, that will not deliver the results that you are intending with that infrastructure. So, with the photo on the left, you have a bin that's intended for 3 different streams, but for the person who's not paying a lot of attention, good luck figuring out which one that is before they've already made that reflexive action to toss something. These bins on the right, these are from Herald Square in New York, and they are beautiful, very nice looking bins, but I challenge you to figure out which one of these is for trash. So, as we talk about these best practices, I want to come back to the concept of a systems approach. If you think about how we used to manage energy 50 years ago, you simply put in the electrical wiring and you had switches and you turned it on, and you wasted a tremendous amount of electricity, tremendous amount of energy with that system. We've, over the last 50 years, we figured out how to bring much greater level of efficiency to that. It's a much more sophisticated system that performs better. We've optimized that system. The same is true in recent decades around traffic management. If we want to cut down on pedestrian injuries and accidents, we know how to design roads that intuitively guide people to slow down. And there are a lot of these different techniques. And I would argue that waste is an area where we've yet to really think about it in those terms. We still think of it in relatively simplistic, it's an operation. It's like trash. You put out a bin, you empty it, and you move on. And to the extent that that's still the way we think, we set ourselves up for this missed opportunity for better performance. So now let's dive into some of these practices a little bit closer. And again, some of these will be familiar to you. I'm not going to go into all these stats. I'll let you read these on your own. I'll also point out that these slides will be available afterward. And for those of you who are interested to really dive in and look at these closer, I've hyperlinked these in the footer notes, how to actually access some of the research papers behind these. So feel free afterward to come back to these. But simply making the point that when we talk about bins that are different colors, the trash is blue, black for trash, and green for organics being the most common, and I would argue increasingly becoming a dominant standard, certainly in the U.S. But when we talk about these, it's a critical to keep in mind when that Homer Simpson is walking down the hallway and he sees two bins in front of them and he's not focused on it, he's going to treat them interchangeably until something prompts him and gives them that just understanding these are different. There is a choice to make. They're not interchangeable. So that's really the role of colors, is creating that prompt that helps people to distinguish them. And so with that in mind, there's a question of, well, how much color do you want? You can just put a very thin little strip around the rim that is blue, et cetera, while the rest of the bin is the same color. And all this is by degrees. There's no one size fits all, but in general, the more it stands out, the more it communicates by having those colors dominant across the entire body or across the whole lid. You can expect that that's going to increase the percentage of people who respond to that prompt. Restrictive openings is the other one that most folks are familiar with. And again, I would just point out that there is research that's documented this impact. With restrictive lids, the main thing that's at work here is simply it forces people to slow down. You can't navigate into a small round hole without focusing your attention. If you have a wide open bin, it's much easier to do that unconscious, tossing basketball style, tossing it into an opening. So it slows people down. The other thing that plays into this is there's research that suggests the actual shape of the opening, that small round hole, it has its own association. People associate that with recycling. And so it's another level of signaling to people, this is for recycling. Communicating information in different stages, understanding the thought process and the steps that people take between where they first recognize there are bins that I can use and actually reaching out and putting whatever item they're holding in their hand into that opening. This was research done by a grad student, a design grad student in British Columbia, and these were prototype bins that were set out in Vancouver, and they're still in use today. But with his research, he was looking at where are the points where people are making that decision as they approach bins. And so he was suggesting that when you're, say, 15 feet away from the bins and looking at the photo on the left, at that stage, you don't necessarily need to know the granular information of what plastic types can go in or et cetera. You need just to know that, A, there are bins and that there's a choice. And so what you get here with these bins, the way they're designed, is it communicates that level of information. It's showing with the color distinction, there are different types of bins. As you get closer, say 10 feet away, that's where you want to start to prime people on, well, what does go in here? What are the items that, what are the basic streams that I'm choosing between? And so you can see with the center image where he's used the term container, you can see it from that distance with the font size that it is. You can see that cup. On the ones behind it, you can see the trash can image. So you're communicating what the streams are at that point. Then it's when you get closer up to 3-4 feet away is when you're at the point where you need to understand, okay, this is for glass bottles, or it's not, or it's for paper, or not. And that's where these bins, they've tested using that level of detail and the smaller font that you can only see from that distance. The other thing I'd point out about these bins, which I think is novel, and I haven't seen these actually in general production, is understanding the direction that people are approaching from. these are on a street corner. Are people going to walk up directly facing them from 15 feet away or not? In this case, no, because it's facing a building. They're approaching from the side. So if your labels, your front is facing forward, people will miss this little detail until they're right up in front of it. So with these, you can see it's created these angles so that you can see it from the common directions of approach. Signage, there's a lot of research, and this is frankly its own webinar, getting into signage, and I won't dive into these too deep, but I would point out, I think I've got a database of probably at least 30 different academic papers that have looked at some aspect of how signage can be designed, and to boil down some just essential aspects of what the lessons learned from those. You need to communicate, again, the high level information, communicate which stream it is in the simplest terms that people can absorb, and then depending on how public a setting it is, because there is a distinction, I think, between, say, a workplace, the bin at the end of the hallway where you're there day in, day out, to use those bins all the time. You become familiar, just like at home, you become familiar with what is acceptable over time, and versus a public park or an airport where you may see that bin once ever and then you'll never see it again. In general, you want to minimize the amount of information that you're trying to convey in that kind of very, very public transitory situation, simply because people are not going to absorb it. Homer Simpson, using that effect, is not going to stop in most cases and read that very granular level of detail. So you need to call out what are the essential items, what are the most common items, what are the most commonly confused items that you want to put onto a sign. When you talk about a setting like an office where people have that, I'll call it an ongoing relationship, there could be more value to adding more information, because over time they will absorb that, and they are, call them a candidate for using that more detailed information once they retain that. Images as well as words. Images definitely people tend to cue on faster, but there's research that shows that by themselves they don't necessarily outperform words. It's having both of them side by side is what makes a big difference. Again, this is a whole webinar by itself that I would love to go into, but we'll keep moving for the moment. Another one, which is like colors, it's intuitive, but up until recently there hasn't been a whole lot to back it up, which is just the fact that where that signage is located and how prominent it is makes a big difference. You can have a small little label that that you can see only when you're right up against it, or you can have something that's up or closer to eye level, or is big. It's across the whole panel of the bin. And I'll just point out there's research that Bush Systems we did in conjunction with the University of Georgia 3 years ago. We did a pilot project and actually tested using different bins with and without those frames that stick up above the bin, and we're able to show a measurable difference. Again, less trash, less recyclables were in for the trash, and there was less contamination. So it's not just about what information, it's also about how you're presenting it. Placement is another big aspect, I think, that tends to be overlooked. I think at this point, most folks are familiar with the fundamental twin the bin. Bins need to be next to each other. If you look at this photo here on the lower left side in this plaza, if you think about the direction foot traffic is coming from, let's say you're coming from the left side, you're going to see that recycling bin there, but you're not going to see the trash bin. So somebody who's going to stop and make a concerted effort will notice the trash bin on the other side, but not the person who's late for a meeting. That blue recycling bin becomes the catch-all for whatever they happen to be throwing away. So when we talk about twinning the bin, putting them next to each other, it's not 5 feet apart. It's not on opposite sides of a plant or architectural feature. It's really having them right next to each other so that they're equally convenient with the direction of traffic as people are approaching. This is another area that I think there's a need for more research and more understanding, but there's a growing appreciation for how do you how do you understand what specific locations will perform better than other ones? Having, as this photo in the upper right-hand corner shows, something that you can see from multiple directions, not just stuck into the back of a hallway next to a closet, but something that can be seen as you're approaching from different directions. Understanding what's being generated in certain locations. Is there a coffee shop at the end of that hallway? That's going to inform that you're collecting more paper cups potentially, or other types of materials that may not be recyclable. So that can help you understand that we're probably going to see more trash or more items that are more easily contaminating. So real basic thing, maybe that's a situation where you make sure the trash bin is the first one that they reach as they are approaching from that direction. It's that level of sort of analytical approach, again, that leads to addressing contamination. And as I'm talking through these, I realize a lot of this requires a fair amount of work to actually set that up. Just like doing waste audits, the way to think of those is it's a long-term investment into an infrastructure that will be more optimized and will perform better over the long term. So this is about making an upfront investment and not just simply tossing out bins and hoping that that things go well. This is another one. If I have a soapbox that I like to get on, step onto, it's the need within the recycling industry put a much more concerted effort into how do we standardize the experience that people have around recycling. We've taken a very hodgepodge. We depend on local communities to decide, well, we're going to use this color, or we like this because for whatever reason. There are myriad of different reasons that gets done, but using this example of stop signs, there's a very concrete reason why you don't see every single community creating its own stop sign. Having that uniformity is critical when you want to make sure that people are stopping in an intersection. And so, when you travel around the world, you will see that same, essentially, American style stop sign in Morocco. You will see it in France. You will see it in China. All around the world. And again, it comes down to you want to make sure that people stop. There's not a room for margin for error there. And so what if that applied to recycling? As it is right now, each facility tends to design its own recycling bins and how they're going to be set up. And this is kind of what that would look like if we were to apply it in that situation. We would have a lot less confidence that people will read all those words on that sign or recognize that, well, green is what a stop sign is in this situation. And so that same logic needs to apply to recycling. So what does that look like? I think that if there's a shining example on the hill that I would point to, it would probably be San Francisco in the Bay Area, Alameda County as well. We've all heard about the great things they're doing with zero waste, but and many of those are practical or not practical to the reality in Tennessee. And I'm in South Carolina, and I know very, very upfront that a lot of what they're doing in California doesn't fly here. It's not realistic. But this is one I would argue we could be making a lot more progress moving in that direction, even if it's on a voluntary level. How do we coordinate? How do we work together across jurisdictions to the extent we can actually achieve it, come up with a more uniform system? So in the case of what they have in San Francisco, and this is now statewide, there's actual state legislation 5 years ago that mandates that blue shall be the color of a recycling bin in all cases. Green shall be the color of composting. And whether that's a shall or it'd be really nice if it was, the more we can point that direction, using standardized terminology, you'll see if you look at these three bins in the middle, all of them are using the exact same language to communicate what compost is. There isn't one that says organics, it says compost in every example. Another aspect of how this concept of uniform standards can apply is back of house. On the right-hand column, this is actually from a presentation that Arizona State University did a few years ago about how they do custodial housekeeping collections from their buildings. They make sure they're using blue bin or blue bag liners for recycling. They use green compostable liners for compost. They use black for trash. And the carts they use correspond to the same color scheme, as do the compactors and the dumpsters out back. And that's because behavior isn't limited just to the public. It also has to do with housekeeping and making sure you have a system that's intuitive for them to do as they're trying to get through their workload and move on to tasks. So the more we can standardize this, the more I think this helps to rise the tide on and float all boats, as it were. So to follow up on this and to show where there's actual evidence, this is just one a project that was done by SBM, which is a large custodial housekeeping contracting service across the U.S. And in this case study, they worked with multiple clients, corporate clients primarily, but also government. And they went through and they did the type of revamping. They took out all the odds and ends, different types of bins that have been added over the years. When you purchase bins at different stages, you might buy different brands and you come up with this hodgepodge ad hoc system even within a facility, within a campus. And with this project, they went through and they removed all those bins and put in a completely uniform system so that everywhere you went in the hallways, in the lobbies, outdoor areas, you would have consistency of what that looked like. And as with the other slides I've shown, there's hard evidence that they came away with on actually improving contamination and capturing a higher percentage of the recyclable materials. So I've been talking about the design of bins primarily up to this point, but there are a couple other examples of how this whole concept of a systematic approach can apply. And some of you may be familiar with the Keep America Beautiful study that was done in 2014. And just for background, we didn't mention this at the beginning, but before I was with Bush, I was with the Keep America Beautiful's National Recycling Department for about 9 years. This was a project that we did with a company called Action Research, where we went into I think we had four different cities, somewhere around 25 different office locations doing waste audits, where we tested different types of bin, just little desk side bins that people would use at their workstations to see what different configurations would work. And we found very clear evidence that what really improved recycling was having this image on the right side where you can see the little black bin that's clipped onto the larger recycling bin. That showed, as you can see, the stats here, it improved, it decreased the amount of recyclables going in the trash from 29% down to 13%, and it improved contamination. So why? What is it about that system that could have that kind of concrete example? And if you stop and think about it and look at this image on the right, again, if you understand that people are not necessarily focusing a lot of attention, they may be willing to recycle, but not if they are knee-deep in the middle of working on a report. And that action to recycle something is largely reflexive. An 8.5 by 11 sheet does not fit into that little black bin unless you make a concerted effort to. With or without that lid, it's not that wide as an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and so your hand is going to intuitively drop that into the bin that is wide enough, that does not require special attention. You can get away with doing this in a workstation environment in most cases because 75+% of what is being generated in that context is recyclable. I wouldn't attempt to apply that concept to a public park, but it does very much in this specific type of environment. So the results of this study have really had a big impact. I work a lot with the college university side, and there's been a large wave of universities that have started to implement this kind of a system, and this is just below that is one example from Indiana University, Indianapolis. But another one I would point to is University of Tennessee. Jay Price, who I've worked with a lot, they implemented this system over the last 5-6 years and have seen similar improvements with their recycling coming from office locations. Another aspect of how the arrangements can be switched around to improve recycling is with who actually empties that bin. So regardless of what kind of bin you're giving somebody at a workstation, the traditional models that you have a waste basket, the custodian comes in at the end of the day, empties that, and walks away. Well, that creates by itself a structural barrier. If you're having to add recycling to that routine, you need a whole new set of bins. You need, in some cases, that might require a whole separate custodial task, which can add to their workload. And that making that investment can be a barrier. In some cases, results in a system where recycling may be available, but the office worker is expected to take that to the bin that's out in the lobby while the custodian continues to empty that trash right next to them. There's an obvious differential convenience, and that has a concrete impact on recycling rates. So if you actually want people to participate, you've got to make them equally convenient. And you can either have the custodian servicing both as part of the routine, or what a growing number of institutions are doing is simply taking the custodian out of that task altogether, especially during the pandemic when there was a big emphasis on cleaning surfaces and reducing touch points. And this was actually an example with the University of Tennessee was a big factor in their switch over to the system. They reframed custodial service to empty trash as kind of a concierge level service that is really not necessary. At the end of the day, people are more than capable of getting up and walking their waste to a central bin. So, so that's what you're seeing is more companies, more universities going to a system where office workers are responsible for emptying their desk side bins themselves into the centralized, and then that's the point where the custodians kick in. They get the centralized bins out of the hallway and they take those down to the loading dock. And not only does that save custodial labor, which can be reapplied to other tasks so that you're doing more cleaning and other things which office workers appreciate just as much, but also it has a measurable impact on the percentage of waste that actually gets recycled. This is another one where there have been whole webinars, and happy to dive into this more. And I also have a blog series that I'll talk a little bit more at the end where I dive more into this topic and how to implement this kind of system. The last thing I'll point out when it comes to a centralized collection, or the last instance I would point to, is with classrooms and meeting rooms. And I've mostly seen this, again, at the university level, simply because that's where you got professors who are willing to put the time in. But taking that same principle of, rather than offering waste collection with the maximum level of convenience, having a bin anywhere somebody can conceivably have or be discarding an item, it's pulling that back and building the expectation that people will walk their waste a little bit. You're not asking them to go too far, but take that to a centralized location because that improves recycling and it reduces the your infrastructure cost and your labor costs over time. So in this instance, what you've seen a number of universities doing is simply taking all the waste baskets out of the classroom entirely. Take it all out, because you're either going to need to add a recycling basket into that room. If it's a meeting room as well, you need to add a recycling to that, or you're left with this structural imbalance where the trash is ultra convenient, but recycling requires an extra effort. And again, we know that when you do that, you lose a sizable percentage of people who are willing to do that. So in the instance of these universities, they took out all the bins out of the classrooms, make sure that they have centralized stations conveniently located so that, and actually mapping out the footprints of a building so that no one person is being asked to go more than a reasonable distance, 50, 60 feet down a hallway before they can get to that centralized set of stations. But once you set up that infrastructure in the hallways, the vast majority of people are more than fine adapting to that system of carrying waste out to the centralized bins. And again, this has a big measurable impact on recycling and reducing contamination. I was wrong. I have one more slide about centralized collections, and that is taking the concept outdoors. This gets a little bit more controversial and again, and very context-based. But do you really need to have trash bins on a ubiquitous level everywhere people go all the time? There's kind of a, if you ask the groundskeepers, there's oftentimes a knee-jerk, absolutely, you need to have that, because otherwise it's going to end up on the ground, and I'm going to have to pick up that litter. And that is absolutely true in many contexts, but it's not automatically in all. So as one example, I know I did a webinar with the Parks Department from the City of Austin last year, where they've been testing out the whole idea with parks of, are there certain types of park locations where you can do that pack it in, pack it out? And there are some where it tends to be more trails. You can get away with that easier. A neighborhood park where with the playground, maybe not so much. You're still going to find litter. But on, say, a campus environment, there's a much more opportunity to do that for a couple of reasons. One, on a campus, you're much more likely to be surrounded by your peers and be observed by your peers. So there's that social expectation is much stronger to not toss stuff on the ground. The other is that as long as you're setting the expectation that you will have a convenient trash and or recycling option when you get to your destination, do you necessarily need to have the bins on the pathway? You just need to make people need to know that they will have the option reasonably soon, and in that context, they're willing to carry items. And so you've seen universities like the ones listed here that have gone through and they've eliminated 85, 50% of the outdoor bins that they had that were along pathways where people aren't necessarily consuming. A picnic area, you definitely need to have bins there. But where people are simply transiting, you don't automatically. And what this does is it removes a big structural barrier that creates a bias against recycling. If you have, in an example of University of Georgia, they had, close probably to 400 outdoor trash bins. What is the cost to be able to match those with 400 additional recycling bins? It's substantial. It's a big financial barrier that's hard to do. And so the default in many cases is that you just end up with a lot of standalone trash bins that continue to collect cans of bottles. But by removing those bins and even repurposing them, painting them blue and putting them back out for the remaining outdoor bins, you're able to eliminate that structural barrier to behavior, and you're also able to address the financial barrier of having recycling bins in the locations you do actually need them. So I'm getting to the end of my presentation. I guess in summary, all this comes down to what I say is the understanding that design matters. If you simply stick out a generic bin and put a label that says recycling on it, and pat yourself in the box, you check that box, you're making a big mistake. And it should not be surprising that we get the results that we do with contamination. Again, this by itself does not determine control all contamination. You do have to have prior knowledge. You do need that education. You need these other aspects, but this is a big chunk of it that by thinking in the systems approach and not just these are kind of one-off, it'd be nice, it'd be optional to have a bin that's blue, but really seeing them in a holistic sense, this could be a critical part of how we fight off a big chunk of that contamination. And so with that, I will stop. I think I have this closing slide. Actually, before I hand it over for Q&A, I'll point out I mentioned that a lot of the research that I cite in here, you can when Caleb sends around the deck to access, these are all hyperlinked, and you'll be able to go in and find the actual sources for these. On this closing slide, what I've put here is just some other resources that I've produced. One is that there's an online database, a Google Doc I created that's got over 100 different recycling behavior-related studies if you really want to geek out and jump into that. So you can access that Google Doc from this presentation deck. I write a blog series periodic as I get to it on a range of these types of topics, touching on these. Some of the topics I've done in recent over the last year are how do you develop uniform bin standards? How do you go through that process, working with stakeholders to decide what that system should look like? How do you implement centralized collections for offices? I sort of gloss through, yes, take away the bin or have people get up and walk to the hallway bin in a very casual way, like, of course, nobody has a problem with that. That's not true. A lot of people object. There's pushback. But there's also, the wheel's been invented, and there are processes, there are communication strategies that can help to get through those and sell the value of the program so that you can actually get it past objections. I will pause there, and I will come back to just my contact information and invite Caleb to come up if we have questions from the audience.
Thanks, Alec. Yeah, and everyone, I've failed to mention at the very beginning that everyone's muted to reduce the amount of background noise. But yeah, if you have any questions, I know that was a lot of information, a lot of great information. But if you have any questions that you sort of want Alec to dive a little bit deeper into, please send those in the chat box. I sent a couple message over to everybody to make sure they knew where that chat box is. So feel free to either choose all participants or all panelists or the host and send your questions there. What I will do quickly while we're waiting to see if any questions come in is I wanted to plug the Environment, Energy, and Recycling Conference that we have coming up at the end of this month. August 24th through 26th is going to be in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. You can, if you're interested or you want to have a little bit more information about that, pull your phone out and scan this QR code. It's a really great conference that we have every year. There's a lot of different breakout sessions that, this is the second year where the Tennessee Recycling Coalition has put it on in collaboration with the Tennessee Chamber. So lots of good people to meet, lots of great networking opportunities, and like I said, full of great information, like very similar to what we heard today from Alex. So definitely wanted to plug that in. We're going to have a lot of fun. I'll be there. So if that's something that interests you, pull your phone out and scan that. That'll bring you to our website where you can figure out how to register, information on the hotels, and you can see a draft agenda of what we've got going on. So I'm going to pull back to, we got a question that came in. It says, curious, do you often give guidance on what an organization buys or uses in the workplace to quote unquote sync with bin setup? Any design ideas for what you buy and how you collect?
Read that back to me again one more time.
Yeah, it was sort of long. Sorry about that. It says, do you often give guidance on what an organization buys or uses in the workplace to sync with, like SYNC, sync with bin setup? We'll start, and then I'll read the last part after that. But
yeah, well, yeah, high level, one of my roles within Bush Systems is to be a resource to customers. So I oftentimes work with our sales reps if they're getting a question from somebody who is looking to quote bins and they're trying to figure out, how many bins do we need for our facility of this size, or other advice around this. Generally, oftentimes I'm available to help consult with a customer who's doing that. Then otherwise, I guess I would point to, I mentioned we have a webinar series that I organize with Bush that goes into a deeper level into the different aspects and different areas of these topics. So we were able to advise in that respect.
Yeah, and I will mention that Alec and I were talking, and I will make sure that whenever he has information on his webinars or blog posts or any type of content that he creates, that I'll make sure to push that out through our TRC newsletter and mention all of that in our webinars that we have. So let's see if we've got any more questions before we sign off. I'm not seeing any, but you have Alex contact information. I'm sure that he would be happy to answer any questions if, you know, once you get off here, you're like, oh man, I wish I would have asked that question. Once again, I just wanted to say, Alex, thank you so much for, number one, what you do, but number two, also like just taking the time to build out this presentation and give it to all of our stakeholders here. Once again, it was mentioned previously that this this has been recorded. We'll put this on YouTube, and the link to the YouTube video, as well as the slide deck that has all of this great information right here, all these links, will be sent out. I'm going to try to get it out today, but if not, it'll be tomorrow to everyone that was registered. So we hope that you enjoyed this. We hope that you got a lot of information out from it. And yeah, we just hope everyone has a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity.